à tous. And now I'll speak English. So, the topic, Gaurangi? We Gaurangi?
Here.
Oh.
How I understand Srila Prabhupada.
How I understand Srila Prabhupada. Okay, so I'll begin at the beginning. I first saw Srila Prabhupada in 1969. In January or February 1969. I was a student at the University of California in Berkeley. You know, America, people are loyal to their college. Anyway, so I was a student at Berkeley, and Berkeley was really the epicenter of the radical student movement in the United States. And I was involved in the revolutionary student movement against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights and so on. And I was walking down the street one day where I lived, and I saw a devotee, as they would say in Italy, arancione. I saw a devotee with a dhoti, and he said to me, "Our spiritual master is going to speak here, and please come." So I'd seen the devotees in the student area, and they had engaged in that really attractive activity that devotees do of collecting donations. And so I'd given them some donations. So anyway, I went in to see Prabhupada's program. I had seen a guru before that, or so-called Swami. When I first went to Berkeley, I took a class in sociology, and in which we studied Emile Durkheim, Lévi-Strauss, and other French social scientists. But so as part of this class, we had to go to a Catholic church, a synagogue. They didn't really have Muslim mosques back then, but a Hindu program and write a report. Typical little college thing, you write a report. So I went to see a Swami, and I could hardly stop myself from laughing because he didn't say anything. I was very philosophical. He kept saying, "Just relax. Everything will be all right. There is no problem. Relax." And that's all he said. I was there with my girlfriend. I had a girlfriend, and so we just started drawing funny pictures because I was 18 years old. So that was my impression of an Indian Swami. I sometimes say that I never could have written The Journey Home, the wonderful book that Raghunath Swami wrote, because before I joined the movement, I didn't really have any interest in Asian culture. I was interested in spirituality, so that was my only impression of a Swami or of a guru. So when I went in to see Prabhupada, I thought, is this another silly program like that? And I was sitting there, and in those days in Berkeley, California, in the late 60s, in general in America, and also, of course, in France, people wanted to experience things. People wanted to have direct experience, consciousness. And so I walked in with some friends, and I walked past all the seats that were set up on campus there, and I sat down on the floor with the devotees because I thought, I want to experience this. So I was sitting there, and then Prabhupada came in. And literally the moment I saw Prabhupada, I knew this is very different. Because I looked at him across the room. He was surrounded by these really heavy disciples. I think it was Vishnu Jana Swami and Tamal Krishna and other Vaishnavas, and so they were walking with Prabhupada. And my first impression, the first time in this life that I saw Prabhupada physically, my first impression was, this person is a real authority. And that was a very radical thing to say, because in those days, our parents were certainly not authorities. The government was absolutely not an authority because they were fighting an evil war in Vietnam. And our professors weren't authorities because they weren't like us. And so for us, no one. In fact, they had a very popular saying back then, "Don't trust anyone over 30." So Prabhupada walked in, and I had this powerful impression, this person is an authority. And I just saw it. And also at that same moment, these were, of course, it's not that I said these things, but just impressions. I thought he's like a military commander. That was my first impression, that Prabhupada is like a military commander, the way he walks, the way he carries himself, and he's a real authority. And so he came and he sat down on the Vyasasana, which in Western Sanskrit is the Vyasasana. He sat down on the Vyasasana and the kirtan started. And the devotees, of course, were so happy to be with Prabhupada. They were, because in those days, I mean, we didn't have the books, or they didn't have, there was just, I think Prabhupada's Little Bhagavad Gita was the only book. So there were no books, there was no movement in India, there were no holy places, there were very few temples. And so really Prabhupada was everything. And so, so the devotees became very ecstatic. They were chanting and dancing right in front. Prabhupada was up on a stage. And I was a little bewildered because I had never experienced ecstatic religious behavior. I was born in a Jewish tradition, and so, it doesn't matter, synagogue, church, you go there and you sit down. All right, please turn to page 17, let us pray. And okay, now please rise. And then please sit down. And you sing songs, and and someone gives a little talk, and then you go have some refreshments, and then you go, forget everything about it until the next weekend. And so I was used to that type of sort of like very nice, very civil religion. So when I saw the devotees dancing ecstatically, I'd never experienced that before. And then Prabhupada actually got up off the Vyasasana and began dancing ecstatically, jumping in the air. And that was 1969, so Prabhupada was 72 and a half years old. 69, 73. Yeah, 72 and a half years old. And which, for me back then was something, it was kind of like 382. Because I was just young. I was 20 years old. And so Prabhupada began ecstatically dancing, jumping, and I was stunned because he was obviously elderly, and and when Prabhupada started dancing, the devotees went completely, as we say in English, berserk. And I remember standing there and just seeing bodies flying in every direction, because the boys were because everyone was young, and they were athletic, they were young, and people were just flying through the sky. And I remember I actually became disoriented. It's like in the Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna at one point, seeing the universal form, Arjuna says, Disho na jane, which literally means, I don't know the directions. So if you think about it, like right now, we take it for granted that we know what is up, what is down, to the sides. We have a certain sense. Actually, it's what the German philosopher Kant called a priori knowledge, in the sense that he said it's not that you experience the world and then you learn about, say, time and space, but rather time and space are kind of built into the hardware. And so without the ability to perceive time and space, you couldn't have any experience, any intelligible experience. And so like Arjuna, I couldn't figure out like what was up and what was down. It was just flying all around these bodies, and I wasn't ecstatic, actually. I wasn't ecstatic. I wanted to be ecstatic, but I wasn't. And so, true confessions of a so-called guru. But somehow in my heart, Krishna told me why I wasn't ecstatic. And the message I got in my heart was, these devotees are actually serving. They're practicing spiritual life, and they're serving. What are you doing? And so I actually understood in a very positive, California positive way, that I don't deserve it. I don't deserve to be ecstatic because I'm not doing anything. So then, it was such a hippie period. Do you know what black lights are? Like in the hippie days, the black lights with the posters? Oh, well, people would take LSD, and they would have these like blue and red posters, and you put a black light on it, and it would anyway. So they're giving out black light posters. The devotees were giving out a poster of Narada Muni that you can use when you're on LSD. So that's the way it was back then. So, moving right along, the next time I saw Prabhupada, I went home for the summer in 1969, and I was walking a friend home one day, young lady, and I suddenly found myself in front of the Hare Krishna temple on La Cienega Boulevard. This is before the Watsika property. And I couldn't find it. I wanted to find the temple, couldn't find it, so I walked in. It was an old church, an old Protestant church, where if you walk in the front, you're actually in the back of the sanctuary. Even Catholic churches like that. If you walk in the back, you're facing the altar. And so Prabhupada was in Los Angeles. I didn't know it until much later, but Prabhupada was living a few blocks from me, because the devotees had rented a house for Prabhupada in Beverly Hills. And that's where my family lived. So I was actually a few blocks from Prabhupada, but didn't know it. And at that point, Prabhupada was translating the Krishna book. It's funny because it's called a summary study, but if you actually compare the English Krishna book to the Sanskrit, which I did when I was translating the 10th canto, Prabhupada starts out, literally the first chapter, the first 10 verses, he kind of summarizes, but after that, he just starts doing every verse. So the summarizing lasted about half of one chapter, or a third of one chapter. And after that, it's just a straight translation with purports mixed in. That's the Krishna book. Anyway, so Prabhupada was doing the Krishna book a few blocks away from my house. And I walked into the temple, and devotees didn't know I was there, because they were all facing toward the altar, and I walked in the back, and I sort of stayed there. And they began reading the first chapter of Krishna book. So when I was still and before I actually became a devotee, I heard the first reading on this planet of the Krishna book, the first chapter, and I was just sitting there, and I didn't know the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and they read the first chapter of the Krishna book, and I understood it was a sacred birth. I said, well, it's analogous to Jesus. We have a sacred birth. But I thought it's much more positive. He's not in a manger. There's opulence and jewels. So the next time I saw Prabhupada was when I came down to LA to be initiated. I decided to join the Hare Krishna movement. Anyway. Did you all know that I actually joined the Hare Krishna? Anyway, so I went up and I joined the movement in Berkeley, because I was a student there, and I had a very close family, and I knew if I joined the movement in LA, it's going to be like, it's too much. So I went to Berkeley and joined the movement, and then came down to be initiated by Prabhupada. And when I was in Berkeley, I had another powerful experience of Prabhupada. That is, there was a poster back then, a black and white poster, that was in every temple in ISKCON. It was Prabhupada sitting down. He has books on both sides of him, and he's very serious, a very serious picture of black and white. And that poster was in every temple. So I was just looking at that poster one day, about a few weeks after I joined the movement, and Krishna just revealed to me that this person is seeing God. So I thought, wow, that's very impressive. So I knew Prabhupada was seeing God. I knew he was a pure devotee, and I went down to see him, and so he was driving in from, I didn't know, but he was driving in from Beverly Hills. He was driving in from a few blocks where I came from. And so I was so nervous. I also went down to be initiated, by the way. And I kept thinking, how am I going to actually see a pure devotee? Because I understood that he was with Krishna, he's seeing Krishna. And it's like Akrura. When Akrura was on the way from Mathura to Vrindavan, he kept thinking over and over again that I'm actually going to see Krishna. So I was really nervous, and so then we stood at the curb, and Prabhupada was going to drive up, and then at the last second, the temple president rushed up to me with a garland and said, here, put this flower garland on Prabhupada. Then I almost fell over backwards. Oh my God, and put a flower garland on Prabhupada. So then he drove up, and his official car in his world headquarters, for all of ISKCON, was a little Volkswagen Beetle. That's the car they had for him. So But I had a very interesting experience. When Prabhupada drove up, it was in the evening, it was already dark because it was January, so the days were short, the sun was already down, and Prabhupada drove up right under a street light. So as Prabhupada drove up, I could see his face very clearly in the front passenger seat. And as Prabhupada drove up, I immediately saw, oh, it's Prabhupada. It's the person I've always been seeing. It's the person I've been seeing every day. It's the person who, in a sense, I know more than I know anyone else. So Prabhupada came, I was initiated. I don't know if you know the story, how what Prabhupada called over-intelligence. Over-intelligence, because we were also, it was also exciting to be initiated by Prabhupada personally, that no one remembered the name that Prabhupada gave him. So therefore, after the ceremony, you'd get a little piece of paper with your name. So I got a paper and it said Hridayananda. And when I saw that conjunction of letters, HRI, I thought, you can't write a word with HRI. And it just seemed like such a strange sequence of letters. I thought, well, it must, whoever wrote this, it wasn't Prabhupada, whoever wrote this made a mistake. It's obviously Hridayananda, which is actually good Sanskrit. Hridayananda means the bliss of the mercy of Hari. So naturally, everyone rushed up to me, what's your name? What's your name? And I said, Hridayananda. Yeah, everyone thought, that sounds right. So for the next 6 months in ISKCON, I was Hridayananda. And there's even a Back to Godhead article by Hridayananda Das Brahmachari. So this went on until one time I wrote Prabhupada a letter, and he wrote back and said, Dear Hridayananda, by the way, your name is Hridayananda. There's one other important thing I should mention about, which is actually in a sense more important than everything I mentioned so far, or not more important, but very important. And that is the first letter that Prabhupada wrote me. Prabhupada had this experience of the first time he met his guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur. The first time he met his guru gave him the instruction that became the whole purpose of his life. I actually had the same experience. So when I joined the temple in Berkeley, I was a student at Berkeley. And of course we had to be students because that was the only way to stay out of Vietnam, if you students weren't drafted. But I joined the temple, and once you join the Hare Krishna movement, I don't think the army wanted us anyway. So I was wondering, should I stay in school and study? Because I was 20 years old. If you know physiology, a 20-year-old male is basically insane. Because their brain hasn't formed and everything. So I was 20 years old, sort of immature, but very enthusiastic. And so I didn't know if I should stay in school or just go on Sankirtan. So I asked the temple president, and he said, I don't know, ask the regional secretary, who was Tamal Krishna Goswami. So I asked Tamal, and he said, I don't know, ask Prabhupada. And that's the way it was back then. I don't know, ask Prabhupada. So I wrote a letter to Prabhupada. I stayed home from Sankirtan one morning, which you had to have a really good reason to do that. And I just worked for an hour or two just on this letter to Prabhupada. And basically asked him, should I stay in school? So Prabhupada wrote back to me. And in that letter, he gave me an instruction, which really became the purpose of my life. Prabhupada wrote back to me and said, I want you to stay in school. I want you to get a good education so that you can present Krishna consciousness to similarly educated people. That was Prabhupada's instruction. That my job, my service in this life would be to educate myself, to learn, and then to present Krishna consciousness to other educated people. That was the purpose of my life. And as I go on, I'll explain. It really ultimately that instruction, which at first just meant, somehow I didn't stay in school actually. Whoops, we were oh well. Ultimately, I wasn't able to stay in school. Just to show you how incredibly mature I was at the age of 20. I was in Berkeley, which was, it's been forever, for the last 50 or 60 years, the #1 public university in the United States. It's considered the best public university in the world. It has like 20 or 30 Nobel laureates, and very strong science program. So I was taking a physics class because there was a science requirement, and I didn't like science. So my last year, I thought I got to take a science class. So I took physics, and the teacher the first day said, "I want to know what you know." So he gave us a little quiz just to see what we knew. Whoops! I'm going to have to stop this because it's anyway, we have other people recording it. So one of the questions was, what is energy? This is UC Berkeley. I mean, the best you could say about Berkeley was that it was highly agnostic and tilting toward atheism. But, it's very heavy. And so what is energy? So I wrote in my answer, energy is the potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Krishna, the superior energy is the spirit soul, and the inferior energy is matter and 8 divisions. That was my answer. And then when the teacher marked it wrong, I was really mad. Because, I was 20 years old. And I was coming out of this revolutionary movement. I was still revolutionary. And so after class, I was arguing with the teacher for like I got in this big debate with the teacher, trying to convince him that no, that's actually the correct definition of energy. Actually, the definition he wanted, which is technically the right one, is energy is the ability to do work. He was actually right, because he didn't ask, what is Krishna's energy? He said, what's energy? So that was my science class. You could see that was not going to get very far. And then I had a French class. Oh, this is interesting, because we're in France. In high school, I had decided to study French. We could study Spanish, French, or Latin, and somehow I wanted to study French. And then at Berkeley, I also studied French. So I was in this advanced French class, believe it or not. And so the same thing, first day of class, this teacher was very interesting. He was from Paris, he was from Paris, and he met and even exceeded all the stereotypes about lusty Parisian men. And because in those days there were no laws about sexual harassment. I mean, no one even knew the term sexual harassment. And so he would call up the most attractive women, the women he thought were most attractive, and he would dance across the classroom with them to illustrate grammatical, like teaching us French grammar and dancing with the girls. And I know. So naturally, so the first day I was sitting there, I had been a strict celibate monk for about 72 hours, and so naturally I was shocked and outraged by the fact that he was not a brahmachari, or at least a celibate grihastha. And so then he said again, same thing. He wanted to know how much French we knew. So he asked everyone to volunteer to give a little 5-minute talk in French, just so he could see what we knew. So of course no one wanted to volunteer, but I wanted to volunteer, because I had to stop this adharma. So I volunteered, and then I went home to the temple, got out my French-English dictionary, I was looking up, dog, cat, camel, ass, chien, chat. Animal. And so the next day, I went to my French class, and I just, it was like, like the nightmare Sunday feast lecture. And and the funny thing is that after I finished, I thought the teacher would either immediately resign as teacher, or he would do something, or kick me out of the class. But he said, that was really nice. I really liked that. Because it was kind of good French back then. But you can see, Prabhupada said stay in school, and there I was, chastising my French teacher, for not being, a celibate Vaishnava. And, trying to convince my physics professor that energy is the superior inferior potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So to make a long story short, I was just too immature to do that, to carry out Prabhupada's instruction. And so I left and I left school and went on Sankirtan. And of course, eventually I had to go back to school because it was the order of the spiritual master. then in 1972, getting back to Prabhupada, in 1972, Prabhupada gave me sannyas. By that time, I was very mature. I was 23 years old, and only 2 or 3 years away from having a full human brain. Because, the male brain doesn't fully mature until... So I took sannyasa actually before my brain matured, which, of course, explains a lot. Anyway, so I took sannyas, and then once I took sannyas, then I became sort of a VIP, very important Prabhu, and I started to have a lot more association with Prabhupada because I was a sannyasi, and therefore obviously a liberated soul. Actually, it's interesting because in 1970, just after I took sannyas, I was with Prabhupada in Los Angeles. And Prabhupada's schedule was he would, of course, get up early in the morning and translate. And then he would go for the morning walk. And unless it was unusual weather like winter, he would usually go at 6 o'clock. He would go out for his walk, and then he would come back around 7:15. And he would walk into the temple room. So when Prabhupada walked into the temple room, the curtains would open or the doors would open. They would play Govindam. And so that was Prabhupada's normal schedule. Then after the class, came upstairs, took breakfast, took a nap, and then he would get up. And usually around 9:30 or 10, again, depending on the time of year where the sun was, he liked to sit under the sun and get a massage. And while he got this massage, he would answer his letters, because there was no internet, and most ISKCON temples could not afford a telephone. And even if they had a phone, people didn't make long-distance phone calls back then. Just unless you were a millionaire or something. And so Prabhupada got letters, so I was sitting with him as he was doing his letters. In Los Angeles, if you've ever been to Prabhupada's quarters in LA, there are 3 rooms, and then one room, the room on the left, has a skylight. A light coming down the glass, and so Prabhupada would sit under that light, and the sun would come in and he would take his massage when it was cold time of year. So a devotee wrote to Prabhupada asking to take sannyas. And Prabhupada wrote, and I was sitting there listening, and Prabhupada said, "What is this sannyas? Why does everyone want to take sannyas? It's just a change of dress." Prabhupada said it's just so he was saying that, it's not that you become an advanced devotee just because you wear a certain kind of clothes. It doesn't mean you're Krishna conscious. And, but anyway, I started spending time with Prabhupada, and there's something I left. Actually, there's another thing I left out, which is important. So, pardon the disrupted chronology, but we have to go back again to 1969. And so Prabhupada wrote me a letter. Prabhupada had written me a letter saying that I should preach to educated people. That was my service. And then, when the Upanishad came out, the Upanishad was the first book that ISKCON published. There was no BBT then, it was ISKCON Press. It was the first book, Prabhupada book, published that actually had the Sanskrit with the diacritic marks. And I loved it. I always loved Sanskrit from the first time. When I first joined, they gave me the Samsara prayers, and I went crazy. I would just take the Samsara prayers everywhere and just sing them and just memorize them. And so when I saw the Upanishad, I became so ecstatic to see you can see obviously what was wrong with this young man. I became ecstatic to see diacritic marks. But anyway, somehow the Sanskrit, I just loved it. And so I started learning to chant all the mantras, and I would teach the devotees. We had a special class to teach the devotees. So Prabhupada heard about this. Because at that time, Prabhupada was the only member of ISKCON that used to quote Sanskrit when he preached. And so Prabhupada heard that I was doing this, and as many devotees reported to me, Prabhupada said, literally, he said, "Who is this boy?" First said, "Who is this boy? He has a transcendental brain." I know it sounds like I'm just speaking well of myself, but it's part of the story. So that's what Prabhupada said, he has a transcendental brain. And then Prabhupada told them to send me. Prabhupada wanted to see me. He wanted to talk to me. He said, "I want to give him special instructions." And so I was sent down from Berkeley to Los Angeles to see Prabhupada. And he told me, "Stay with me and I will personally teach you Sanskrit." So when I heard that, As we say in America, I felt like I died and gone to heaven. But that was it. I thought, I'm going to travel with Prabhupada. Prabhupada was flying from Los Angeles to Tokyo. And so I thought, and Brahmananda was going to get him a ticket, Prabhupada a plane ticket. And I drove Brahmananda downtown to buy the plane ticket. I thought, well, don't you want to buy a ticket for me too? Because Prabhupada said, stay with me and I'll teach you Sanskrit. But he said, no, Prabhupada didn't say you're coming to Tokyo. So later I understood that by staying with Prabhupada, it meant staying with Prabhupada. And then it did become very easy for me to learn Sanskrit. So then I began I was traveling all over America, giving programs in universities. Prabhupada liked the program very much. I was traveling with Satsarupa. And Prabhupada, even in Vrindavan, he was giving a Nectar of Devotion class in Vrindavan, and he talked about how much he liked that program. He said, 2 American Goswamis are traveling and preaching. So, anyway, time passed. In 1974, Prabhupada called me to his room in Mayapur during the first annual Mayapur festival and asked me if I would be GBC of Latin America. And at that point, my relationship with Prabhupada became even much more, regular, in the sense that, because I was responsible to Prabhupada for a big part of the world. There were like over 20 countries there. And so at that point, I was responsible to Prabhupada, so, I talked to him all the time about different things. He came and visited my zone. So, and it went very well. I mean, it somehow or other, by Prabhupada's mercy, it grew. It was like a Hare Krishna explosion in Latin America. So, so apart from this very brief biography, I want to talk about what it was like to be with Prabhupada. And you've heard that story. I mean, Prabhupada used like when devotees were discouraged because they couldn't spread the movement, he would say, there's a Bengali saying, if you sell cucumbers, there are many customers, but if you sell a diamond, there are few customers. Anyone heard that? So, what I want to say is Prabhupada never spoke to me about cucumbers. That's the point I want to make. Prabhupada had spiritual children. He loved his spiritual children. He cared about them very much. Just to give one simple example, one time in 1970, like January, February 1970, I went down to L.A., Los Angeles to see Prabhupada, and in those days we didn't really do book distribution. It was all kirtan, so the leaders would just play the drum like 8 hours a day, and so you had to wear tape on your fingers so you could, not flay yourself alive, skin yourself alive. And so Prabhupada arrived at the temple in the morning. He had this beautiful little ritual that he created, where he would drive up in the morning on Watsika. He would get out of his car, and he had a little basket, a little straw basket. And in this basket he had flowers, and we were all in 2 rows on our knees like this, and Prabhupada would walk between us, and he would give every devotee a flower, and the devotee would give him a flower, and he would take the flower and put it in his basket, and he would just exchange flowers with every devotee. So I was there, and I had tape around my finger because of playing the drum. And Prabhupada stopped, and he was very concerned. He wanted to know, he said to me, what's wrong with your finger? I mean, this is just very typical of Prabhupada. He was really seriously concerned to know if there was something wrong with my finger. I also saw Prabhupada chastising a female disciple because her child ran into the street. And Prabhupada was, he was like a real person. He was very upset. Prabhupada was very, very upset because he saw a child run into the street. And little child, and I mean, there wasn't a lot of traffic in those days on Watsika, but he was very disturbed. And he was telling this lady, you have to watch your child. And she was saying, oh, Prabhupada, it's all right, blah, blah. And he was really upset because a child ran into the street. So that was the real Prabhupada. That was the real Prabhupada. One thing I should also mention about ISKCON history, in all its glory and challenges, and that is, in my mind, there was a golden age of the Western Hare Krishna movement. And that golden age of the Western Hare Krishna movement was roughly, let's say, from 1966 to about 1970. And I'll tell you why I think it was a golden age and what changed after that. And I think, Generally, the changes are remembered, ISKCON's historical memory, they're generally remembered as like glorious changes, but I think in many ways there were something unfortunate happened. So, from 1966 until 1970, roughly, Prabhupada, he knew, certainly 60 to 69, he sort of knew everyone. I mean, he knew all the devotees. He personally knew all the devotees, and all the devotees personally knew him. And the relationship with Prabhupada was different than what it became. I mean, you can read this. There are these wonderful books like Mukunda Goswami's book, Miracle on 2nd Avenue, which I think is a great book, or Guru Das wrote a great book. And, so if you look at three things changed. Let's say, first of all, I'll look at three relationships as they were during what I consider to be the golden age of the Western Hare Krishna movement, and how all three relationships changed, and in some ways, I think, deteriorated after that. One relationship was between Prabhupada and his disciples. Now we know that, as Prabhupada always said, Vani and Vapu, that we should serve the message of the Guru, not just be attached to the body of the Guru. And, of course, I mean, that's certainly true. In fact, we see that when Prabhupada left, those disciples who really understood Prabhupada as a spiritual teacher, not just as a source of amazing spiritual anecdotes, the people who really saw Prabhupada as he saw himself. Prabhupada once wrote a letter to a devotee, which I read, saying, "You are not seeing the real form of the spiritual master." He gave the example that when the moon passes through the clouds, we think that it looks like the moon is sailing through the clouds, but actually the clouds are moving. So Prabhupada said, you're only seeing the external form of the Guru. But anyway, even though we should serve the message of the Guru, but Prabhupada was not, you could say, mythologized. And if you know your, sociology of religion, Max Weber and so on, Durkheim, oh well, can you take a little bit of sociology? Is that all right?
With pleasure.
Okay. I'll try to give you a little dose. A little bit of sugar makes the medicine go down. Mary Poppins. Anyway, so Max Weber, who's sort of the father of the sociology of religion, he kind of invented it as a field, he talks about something which you can see in the history of all new religious movements. And that is, in the beginning you have a charismatic leader. And this comes from the Greek word charisma, with a K. And charisma in Greek is very much like the Sanskrit Shakti Avesh. Shakti Avesh. Shakti means power, and Avesh means investing power. When God invests his power in a soul, Shakti Avesh. So the Greek word, which really has that sense, is charisma. So in the sociological sense, a charismatic leader is one who is seen by the followers, because sociologists can't say the person really has the power or not, and there are bogus leaders. So therefore, sociologists just say, well, it's one who is seen as possessing this special gift from God, this special power, which is, of course, exactly the way we saw Prabhupada. And so, but when someone has that power, or someone is perceived as having that power, then all authority is embodied in that person. It's like when we were devotees, we went on Sankirtan to sell books. Like if it said, you can't sell anything here, that was a joke. That's just for the non-devotees. We obey a higher law. We serve a higher authority. I mean, that was, to say the least, the mood. So, or even, for example, Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. There was the idea that, you can't understand Shastra without Prabhupada. You can't understand previous acharyas without Prabhupada. So really, Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra is really just Prabhupada. So this is very typical. This is very typical of the first generation when you have a very powerful, charismatic leader. Now, what happens is, when the leader inevitably passes away, this creates a crisis for a religious community. KR?
I'm sorry, we have some key issues we need to deal with.
Just wait until the class is over.
Oh, just it is urgent. Sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah, hopefully.
She'll take care of it. So, so this charismatic leadership can be very powerful because by definition, for the believers, nothing can contradict the leader's authority. Not only because the authority is always right, because as we know, there are authentic leaders and there are leaders who, may preach other things that are not authentic, but because people see this leader as having all authority, a priori, nothing can contradict that leader's authority. So it can be very powerful, but when the leader passes away, there's a crisis. Because people depended very much on the personal presence of that leader. And this creates a crisis in the community. So, not so much for the people who are attached to the instructions, but most people, I think we have evidence that you could say most of Prabhupada's disciples, I think you'd have to say that to be to be objective, despite Prabhupada's instructions, were attached to the personal form of Prabhupada. For one thing, Prabhupada always used to say that, why don't you read my books? So even when Prabhupada was here, there was a problem that people weren't reading his books, the devotees. And Prabhupada used to complain about that. And then when Prabhupada left, his disciples served him, but after some time, you'd have to say most of them no longer engaged in active service. And so it's not so easy to really be attached to the message, the instructions, is not so easy for most people, and therefore, when a charismatic leader leaves, what do the people do? And so generally, what they do, if you study the early history of Christianity, or the early history of Buddhism, or the early history of ISKCON, or of any religion, what you find is there's a tendency to mythologize the leader. There's a tendency to mythologize the leader because by doing that, it compensates for the lack of the leader's physical presence. So in the case of Jesus, in the case of Jesus, we have an extraordinary example of that, where Jesus was made into God, which basically has absolutely nothing to do with the historical Jesus. Or in the case of Buddha, who was, if you look at Mahayana Buddhism, Buddha was turned into many things, which have nothing to do with the actual historical Buddha as it was recorded, as his life was recorded. In the case of Prabhupada, when I say mythologize, I accept Prabhupada completely as a pure devotee. In fact, Prabhupada personally told me that he was never a conditioned soul. Prabhupada personally told me that privately, that he always knew Krishna. So it's not a question of seeing Prabhupada in some material way. But for example, taking all of Prabhupada's statements on any subject, even like World War II or the best cure for, a common cold or something, that everything Prabhupada says on any topic, even a material topic, is infallible and it's coming from omniscience. Because since Krishna speaks through Prabhupada, and since Krishna is omniscient, everything Prabhupada says must be right. Now, Prabhupada rejected this. Prabhupada was directly asked, is a pure devotee infallible or omniscient on material things? And he rejected this idea. He said it's nonsense. Only God knows everything. He said the qualification of a pure devotee is that a pure devotee is purely teaching about Krishna. So, just to get, I guess, to the point I'm driving at, I think a very unfortunate aspect of this mythologizing, and by mythologizing I mean not seeing Prabhupada the way he presented himself. Prabhupada described himself. Prabhupada talked about his position as guru. So if we instead see Prabhupada, is it okay?
We're gonna make it.
Okay. So, I accept Prabhupada personally. If you want to know how do I see Prabhupada, the way he presented himself. Because, I mean, a very interesting question comes up. Some people seem to believe that we should see everything through Prabhupada's teachings, namely the universe, God, the soul. But there's one thing we should not see through Prabhupada's teachings. And that one thing is Prabhupada. In other words, rather than paying attention to what Prabhupada says about himself, what we really know is that, Prabhupada knows everything. It's very interesting because to give an analogy of how common this is, look at the 4th century. The 4th century after Jesus, in which the 300s, in which the entire Christian world divided into two in opposition. On one side were the Trinitarians, the people who believed in this, amazing doctrine of the Trinity, which has very little to do with Jesus. But anyway, they believed in this doctrine of the Trinity, that Jesus is God, fully man, fully God. On the other hand, you had a group called the Arians, because they followed an Italian priest named Arius. And the Arians said, hey, look, if you want to know what Jesus is, why don't you just read what Jesus says about himself? So whenever Jesus talks about his relationship to God, Jesus always says, God is greater than me. I'm just a servant of God. He always says that. And so what's interesting here, though, is that ultimately Jesus lost his right within his own church to describe himself. Because by the end of the 4th century, there were 4 variables. There was the Arian movement, which said, hey, listen to Jesus. There was the Trinitarian movement that said, no, don't listen to Jesus, listen to the church. And then there was the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. So it was just like going around and around these 4 variables. You can work out the math. But anyway, with every possible combination. So by the end of the 4th century, the Trinitarians won, partly by preaching, partly by violent suppression of their opponents, which included burning churches down and beating people and other very Christian activities. So by the end of the 4th century, when the Trinitarians won, it became a capital crime, peine de mort. It became a capital crime, punishable by death, to preach in the Roman Empire that when Jesus describes himself, we should believe him. I find that a remarkable testimony to the power of human beings to be crazy. But that's what happened. By the end of the 4th century, it became a capital offense, punishable by death, to preach that to understand Jesus, we should hear what he says about himself. Similarly, I have to say, if we're going to be honest here, adults. Are we supposed to be adults? Anyway. So the point is that some people get offended or think it's shocking, controversial, if I take Prabhupada the way he presented himself. As a pure devotee, but not materially omniscient and infallible. So why is this even relevant? Is this just some, you could say, petty? Actually, it comes from French petit. In English, they have the word petty, from petit. Some just insignificant theological argument, like, is this an example of religious leaders that have too much time and just engage in these silly arguments? Actually, no. There's really something at stake. I personally think the world is at stake. I'll explain why. Because this mythologizing, in which everything Prabhupada said or did is infallible and is meant to be for the next 10,000 years, creates a major problem for his followers. Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, in chapter 6 of the Nectar Devotion, as Prabhupada presented it, Rupa Goswami gives a list of the fundamental principles of Bhakti Yoga which you cannot change. You can't change these principles because that's just what we do. That's Rupa Nuga Krishna consciousness. And then there's a list of principles that not only can you change, but you should change to adapt to time and place. So whether you are a giant, like a mammoth elephant, or a religious movement, you will go extinct if you don't adapt to your environment. You know, you can be ISKCON or you can be a saber-toothed tiger. You know, the big tiger. And you'll go extinct if you don't adapt. So, in the Bhagavatam, there are 2 verses in the Bhagavatam. One in the first canto in glorification of Bhishma, who's lying on a bed of arrows, and he's glorified as Deshakala Vibhaga Vit. Vit, or Vit, is English wit, from like Veda. It means a knower. A knower. And voir in French actually is linguistically related to Sanskrit Veda, voir, which is Latin vedere, to see. But anyway, so Bhishma knew Vibhaga, the differences, the distinctions of Desha, places, Kala, and time. And the same phrase, Desha Kala Vibhaga Vit, is found in the 4th canto when Narada Muni tells Dhruva Maharaj, you must serve Krishna understanding differences between different places and different times. For example, France in 2017 is not medieval India. And it's not even France in 1968. You may have noticed some very subtle differences in the last 50 years in France. Hardly detectable, but if you look closely, you'll find that France today is a little different than it was 50 years ago. So, in his purports, these verses, Prabhupada says that you must adapt. This is France. This is France. And we can go into the whole history. I mean, if you want to understand how France responds to the Festival of India, you have to go back to the 1600s. I mean, you have to know the geography of France, the fact that in Western Europe it was by far the richest country. There's a reason for that, because it has the most agricultural land, and the basis of the European economy up until the Industrial Revolution was agriculture. England is very small. Spain is the most mountainous country in Europe besides Switzerland. And it's semi-arid in the south. Germany is colder than France. That's why Germans, I mean, you go back 2,000, I mean, what was Julius Caesar doing in France? Basically keeping Germans out. So if you can go back 2,000 years, and the Germans keep trying to come into France because the weather's better. I mean, they don't have beaches. And the North Sea, that doesn't really count. And so Germany is colder than France. It has the Alps. And so Italy is also geographically much smaller than France. It has 2 major mountain ranges. Of course, the Alps come in, to northern Italy. Then you have the Apennine. The Apennine range. And so, and Italy, like Spain, being a Mediterranean country, is semi-arid in the south. As you go south in Italy, basically you can grow olives and other kinds of olives and oranges, citrus fruit. So if you look at France, just do the math. France, by far, has the largest amount of what's called arable land that's really good for all kinds of agriculture. Arable. Do you have the word in French? That comes from Sanskrit. Haladara, Lord Balaram. Hala means plow. Hala or hada. Ada is plow. So arable means plowable. Anyway, it comes from Sanskrit. So France, therefore, that's why you get Louis XIV with this, sort of decadent wealth, because France is the best country in Europe to produce wealth, which was based on agriculture. When you produce wealth, when you have a lot of money, you buy culture. I mean, even what was it? Attila the Hun. Even the Huns, They started to buy culture when they came into Europe. So France had the money, they had the power. Money means power, and it became the most, this center of European culture. It became the center of European culture. And then you have this extraordinary event in which the commercial center of basically the world outside India shifted from the Mediterranean Sea. For like thousands of years, the commercial superhighway of this whole part of the world was the Mediterranean. And then, with the discovery of the Americas, that shifted to the Atlantic. And with the shift of the global commerce shifted to the Atlantic, France, all the countries facing the Atlantic, France, Spain, and England, became world powers. And so with that, you have, these French colonies, and you have this battle going on between Le Monde anglophone and Le Monde francophone. And, anyway, the English kind of won. So, but the reason I'm mentioning all this is because in France, as I see it, educated French people, or it's just kind of in the DNA of France, they have this very strong sense of the cultural importance, the historical importance of their country. It's very, very strong. It's very strong. And also because you have this little immigration problem. I don't want to get into that. I'm not going to give an opinion on it, but you have a little immigration problem. It's a problem in the sense that there's a lot of people that are really disturbed about all these things. And so France, more than ever, France, a country which French was like the language of Europe. If you read War and Peace, Guerre et Paix, by Tolstoy, sophisticated Russians in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, spoke French. On my American passport, it's in English and French. And so France, and even today, France is just, it has been France, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the first country, or I could say the first region really, to successfully unite as a country was France. France was the first region after the collapse of the Roman Empire to successfully form a nation. And so if you look at, and now with this cultural problem where the French more than ever want to defend their culture and their way of life, they don't want to be culturally colonized by other parts of the world. And so in this historical situation, to come into France and try to convince people to adopt an Asian culture, it's like, you cannot be serious. You cannot be serious that you're going to come into France in 2017 thinking you can convince people to adopt an Asian culture, like Asian food, Asian dress, Asian architecture, Asian music. You just can't be serious. Because it's like madness. Again, if we go back to chapter 6 of the Nectar of Devotion, there are basic principles of of bhakti yoga, and there are details. So what France will accept, what America will accept, what Canada will accept, what even Luxembourg may accept, anyway, what the Western countries will accept is a spiritual science. The French are very intelligent. Unfortunately, or I guess it's good for America, it's not good for France. There's 40,000 of the most intelligent young French people in Silicon Valley in California. 50,000 of the most intelligent, entrepreneurial. Anyway, that's why I won't go into the whole thing of Macron, what he's trying to do to bring them back. But the point is that the French people are very intelligent. And skepticism, the French are a little skeptical. But guess what? In the Bhagavatam, third canto of the Bhagavatam, Sankhya Yoga, when the Bhagavatam or Kapila Muni is explaining buddhi, intelligence, rational intelligence, he says the first symptom of rational intelligence is samshaya, which means doubt. So the fact that the French are inclined to doubt, douter, it is related to the fact that they're actually intelligent people. And there's a lot of stupid things going on. And so I'm not saying they're perfect. You know, we all know. If you live in a country, you know how terrible it is. But anyway, I believe in France. I don't think the test of whether French people are sincere or interested in Krishna is whether or not they want to become Indians. And if you give them that test, if we give them that test, like you want to get to God, you want liberation, you've got to show that you've got to embrace Indian culture if you want God. And that's basically what the Hare Krishna movement is doing all around the world, and I think it's a disaster, at least in the West. It works well in India. I mean, it works well in India. It somehow works, you know, in Russia to some extent. But in the Western world, not just the Western world, the first world, because you can include Japan there. In the first world, it is a disaster. It's a disaster. Because I was with Prabhupada. I saw what the Hare Krishna movement was. And that's the last point I want to make, is that Prabhupada, when I used to sit with him, he always liked to talk to me. Well, my mother, this is a funny story, my mother went to see him one time in Los Angeles. She came to see me, actually. And so I said, hey, let's go see Prabhupada. And she didn't have a good excuse, so we went up to see Prabhupada. And it was so funny. The first thing Prabhupada told my mother was, your son is very intelligent. So, I mean, somehow, I always felt really stupid in Prabhupada's presence, but somehow he said these things. And of course, my mother loved Prabhupada as soon as he said that. So, bringing this back to the point about the routinization of charisma, or like mythologizing a charismatic leader after his departure or her departure, what's happened is that everything Prabhupada did, Prabhupada dressed a certain way, Prabhupada ate a certain way, Prabhupada liked to do certain things, so that becomes frozen, like that's the only way you can ever do these things. Like you can't have a truly Western Hare Krishna movement. You can't have a truly French Hare Krishna movement. Why? Because Prabhupada wasn't French. Or other gurus aren't French. And the problem is that all these things, like you have to dress this way, you have to offer Krishna certain things, you have to use certain kinds of music, you have to use certain kinds of architecture. None of these things are in Rupa Goswami's list of basic principles. They're just not in the list. They're not in the list of basic principles. There are details that you can and should change to adapt. And so there's no use in a spiritual science if there are no spiritual scientists. Let's say someone is sick and has a treatable disease, but there's no doctor. The fact that a medical science exists in the world will not help that person. There has to be a medical scientist. And so Prabhupada presented a spiritual science, but are we spiritual scientists? Do we really understand the science of Bhakti Yoga, or have we adopted a religion which has a good philosophy? I was in Israel before I came to Italy and now France, and it's a very touchy subject there, like converting people to another religion for obvious reasons. And so I was giving a public lecture, and people were asking about that, and I told them the truth. I said, when I was young, I wasn't looking for another religion. I already had a religion. I was born in a religion. I went to a place of worship. I experienced God there. And we had an ethnic tradition, like in certain holidays, you dress in certain ways or make certain kinds of food. I wasn't looking for a religion. I was looking for a spiritual science. So, to me, that's the challenge to us. Are we able to become spiritual scientists? And finally, about Prabhupada, he had a great vision for the world. One thing which disappoints me very much, and to be honest, and I'll just, say it, it's something I find practically in every Gaudiya Vaishnava movement I know of, without exception. including the one I belong to. And that is, it's very hard for me to find that special spirit of Prabhupada, which most inspired me. And by that I mean, we have to change the world. We have to do something huge. This has to become the Yuga Dharma for America, for France, for Brazil, for everywhere. This is the Yuga Dharma. That spirit of doing something gigantic, of really changing the world, I just don't find it very much. I don't find people talking about it. I don't find people dreaming about it. I certainly don't, I have to say, in the movement I belong to, I'm not aware of any actual plan. If you look at the Hare Krishna movement in the West, what it was, what Prabhupada did, and look at it now, there are very significant differences. And they're not, some of them are nice, most of them are kind of unfavorable. So, but it's much smaller. But what's the plan? Is there actually a plan to fix this? I'm not aware of one. I mean, besides Krishna West. That's your cue. So just to end, there's one last thing, because I said I was going to say something, and then I got carried away by my whatever. The three things that changed, the golden age of ISKCON in the West. Because this kind of ties everything together, because I'm dedicating the rest of my life, however many years I have, chanting Hare Krishna, worshipping Krishna, overeating, all our basic spiritual activities. So the three things that changed in the golden age of the Western Hare Krishna movement, Prabhupada was not mythologized. People saw him as a pure devotee. Everyone knew Prabhupada's Prabhupada, that Krishna sent him to save us. And yet, Prabhupada trusted his disciples. Prabhupada opened a center in 26 Second Avenue. Why? Because he was omniscient and knew that's the place to have a Hare Krishna? No. Because his disciple, Mukunda, said that's the best place. And then Prabhupada opened a center. He sent his disciples to San Francisco. Why? Because Prabhupada knew there was a big youth thing going? No. Because his disciples told him, we need to be in San Francisco. That's what's happening now, in San Francisco. And you see pictures of Prabhupada walking with his leading disciples, his personal servants. They're not all wearing Indian clothes. Half the time they're wearing Western clothes, or more than half the time. Sometimes their hair is growing out. And because Prabhupada took the traditional role of a spiritual leader, a holy teacher, he knows God, he teaches about God, he keeps his disciples within reasonable boundaries, like, you can't sell marijuana to get money to buy a temple. Just keeping his disciples within reasonable boundaries. But otherwise, trusting that American devotees should know America. French devotees should know France. Personally, for 3 years, somehow, Krishna inspires us in different ways, I have been watching the news on France 24 every day, religiously, in French, from Paris, Les Actualités. And so I actually know a lot about France. I mean, not like you, but I really know what's going on economically, politically, socially. I know what, at least in terms of mainstream media, attitudes toward religion, culturally, and so on. And, if you look when the British had their empire, they had these schools at Oxford and Cambridge, at the best universities, to train people who are going to go to different countries, to learn the language, to know the culture, to be sensitive. The same thing in the American Peace Corps. Do we have anything like a process where preachers in a country are actually educated to be sensitive to the culture, to the history, to what's going on? Are we trying to culturally colonize France? Anyone that's trying to culturally colonize France really should have their head examined. Anyone that thinks they can culturally colonize this country really needs help. It's not going to happen. So don't hold your breath, because you'll die within. So it's just not going to happen. But what France will accept, I believe, is a spiritual science, because they're intelligent people. So the relationship with Prabhupada, the real relationship with Prabhupada, I believe, Prabhupada preferred, because the movement grew explosively, like say 1970 and after that. And Prabhupada complained about the fact that he had to manage. Prabhupada wanted to trust us, you, to figure out how to spread his movement in your country. That's what Prabhupada wanted. And the movement grew so fast that he had to start managing different things, and he didn't like it, he hated it, he kept saying, get me out of here, I just want to write my books. And yet that role, which Prabhupada didn't want, that he always complained about, is the role some people think we should keep him in, because every little temporary detail about how to present things is an eternal Sanatana Dharma, which is very far from a spiritual science. So the relationship between Prabhupada and his disciples was different back then. The relationship among devotees was different. For one thing, because up until actually 1972, there weren't sannyasis in ISKCON. In 1970, Prabhupada made 4 sannyasis, and within a very short time, they kind of did crazy things. And so, again, there were not sannyasis in ISKCON. But why is that important that there weren't sannyasis in ISKCON? Because up till 1970, I took sannyasa in 72, because you didn't have this, how should I put it, the same level of authoritarianism in ISKCON. Just like, for example, when I got married in 1970, I was married. I was grihasta. And I had a great wife, actually.
She's great.
Yeah. It was Krishna's mercy I had such a great wife, because otherwise, you imagine taking sannyas at the age of 23, and then you get to be 30 and 33, and you start thinking, what if I would have had a good wife? I mean, what if I didn't have a good wife? Then you start thinking, oh my God, I didn't like householder life, but I didn't have a good wife. What if I had a good wife? So I think Krishna sent me a great wife so that I never had that doubt. I always knew it's just, whoops, wrong ashram. So, but up until then, it was just like in the material world, if 2 young people get married, everyone's happy. Their family's happy. Everyone's happy, a marriage. And ISKCON was like that. If you were brahmachari, and you got married, it was like you were advancing. And actually, that's in the Bhagavatam. Because in the Bhagavatam, when you have the universal form of Krishna, just as the 4 varnas are mapped onto the universal form, the Shudras are the feet and the legs, the Vaishyas are the waist, that means they should feed us, and the Kshatriyas are the arms, the Brahmins are the head. So the ashrams are also mapped onto the Virat Rupa. So the brahmacharis are the feet and legs, the householders are the waist. That means, in the Bhagavatam, householder life is above brahmachari life. And that was actually the mood. I mean, Naistika brahmachari is something else, has its own status, I guess. And so, but so what I mean to say is you didn't have this authoritarianism where, you have leaders that think they can just lord it over other people. They're better than other people. They can tell everyone what to do. It wasn't like that. Everyone was kind of like friends. Everyone was kind of the same age. And so the relationship between devotees was much less hierarchical, and you didn't have the same level, frankly, of abuse. Because Prabhupada said, and we're talking about these early days, he said the purpose of ISKCON is to train devotees to be independently thoughtful. Prabhupada wanted a Brahmin movement, not a Shudra movement. And yet some leaders seem to be more comfortable treating people like Shudras. Like, do this, do that, shut up, do what I said, okay, get out of the temple. And actually what Prabhupada really wanted was a Brahmin movement, and Brahmins treat each other with mutual respect. So I think the relationship between devotees back then was much more family, friends, and finally the relationship between men and women. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep this in the second category. In the relationship between devotees, men and women, when I joined the movement in 1969 in Berkeley, it was basically like half men, half women, and we were like brothers and sisters. Women weren't Maya. They were, actually we called them gopis or something. Then they gradually became witches. But Anyway, they didn't really become witches, they were just called that. So, but what I'm saying, when I joined the movement, the men and women were brothers and sisters. I had no sense. In the temple I joined, I had no sense at all that I was better than the women because I was in a male body, which is obviously a stupid idea. And I had no sense of that. I didn't think that. I just thought, these are my saintly sisters. And we had real affection for each other. I mean, we actually really liked each other. And we just had fun. It was just like brothers and sisters having fun serving Krishna together. And that's what it was like. And as far as our relationship with the non-devotees, as in English, as I say, throw the F-bomb, fruitive workers. Are we allowed to say karmi anymore? Anyway, as far as the non-devotees, we fit in with them. Because we used to go to political demonstrations. We were part of the youth scene. It wasn't this, hey, come on in. Venez, bien. Future client. So, in those days, in terms of the relationship between the devotees and the non-devotees, it was also much more friendly. We used to go to political demonstrations, chant Hare Krishna, and we just fit in. We were like part of the world. We were Vaishnavas, but we were part of the world. So I think in all three ways, all three relationships actually deteriorated. In the collective, sort of, in the historical memory of ISKCON, when we started book distribution, we started making more devotees, and everything, grew. That's the golden age. But actually, in some ways it is, but in some ways it wasn't. Because the movement grew so fast that you go from a situation where all the devotees know Prabhupada, and he knows all the devotees, and Prabhupada's not mythologized against his own instructions, and within a few years, 90% or more, maybe 95% of all the devotees in ISKCON have never had a personal conversation with Prabhupada. And actually that change happened very quickly. So when you don't have Prabhupada's, you don't really know him personally, so he starts getting mythologized, even while he's still in this world, because his personal association was actually removed even when he was still on the earth, in a sense. And then the relationship between devotees. You have a bunch of young sannyasis. I was one of them. I plead insanity, I guess. But you have these young sannyasis, and you have book distribution. Now, one devotee wrote this very interesting sociological paper saying that with the book distribution revolution, ISKCON became militarized. ISKCON became militarized. Instead of being these happy communities, brothers and sisters, it was like this military thing. Go out, the karmis are just kind of like walking Lakshmi points, walking book points. And so the relationship with the non-devotees, I think, really went down. Instead of them being like our old friends who are still not devotees yet, but they were our old friends, they just became these hopelessly ignorant people that needed to buy books and give us money. So, in the relationship with Prabhupada, in the relationship between devotees, including gender relationships, and in our relationship with the public, I think there were some major problems. And yet that's remembered as, the most glorious period. So I don't want to minimize the importance of, making lots of devotees, opening temples. That's obviously wonderful. But I want to go back to what I see as the golden age of the Western Hare Krishna movement. I want to go back to a time when we have the real Prabhupada who's not mythologized, the real Prabhupada that gave us the flexibility to have a French Hare Krishna movement, or an American Hare Krishna movement, or an Australian Hare Krishna movement. And more collegial relationships. I can honestly say, I'm not just trying to be humble, first of all, because no one would believe me if I, tried to act humble. I wouldn't believe it, but actually, I don't really think that I'm better than you. I don't really see that. I don't really think, I see that we're really equal, because the difference, that there's some like hierarchy, sannyasi, householder, blah, 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 that's external. That has to do with our bodies, not our soul. As souls, we are all equal. And so a bona fide guru, or a bona fide spiritual leader, is supposed to know that. If someone presents themselves as a guru or a GBC or a sannyasi, but has actually seen the bodies and therefore thinks I'm better than you, I'm higher than you, then that's, I think the technical word is hypocrisy. I mean, obviously in a spiritual society, people offer a certain respect to someone who's dedicating their life to preaching or whatever, but the main qualification of a spiritual leader is that that person knows that we're all equal. In fact, you cannot achieve real bhakti, the highest bhakti, unless you know that. It's right in the Gita. Krishna says, Samak sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhakting labate parang. Only those who see everyone as equal can achieve the highest bhakti. And Krishna says, Samohang sarva bhuteshu. I am equal to everyone. I am equal to everyone. Krishna says, Pandita samadarshana. That the wise see everyone equally, not only among like grihastas and sannyasis, but animals. So therefore, it's interesting because somehow or other in the Hare Krishna movement, as I know it, there has not been this powerful emphasis on equality, égalité. But actually, equality is one of the most important topics in the Gita. Equality is actually one of the most important topics in the Gita. It's just not emphasized. But if you look at the Sanskrit, if you read my book... Okay, now we begin the infomercial. Hi, everybody. My name is H.D.Goswami. And I am... Anyway. So, another big topic in the Gita, which is not emphasized, frankly, is the importance of being rational. The importance of being intelligent and thinking. I mean, sometimes, among some devotees, there are 5 sinful activities. The first 4, number 5 is thinking. And so, really, c'est si mauvais. So, anyway, in the Gita, Krishna describes his teaching in the Gita as Buddhi Yoga, the practice of spiritual reason, intelligence, rationality. Actually, and Prabhupada said religion and philosophy. So many devotees think religion and philosophy means just that, you serve Krishna and you know our philosophy. But that's not what Prabhupada means. He actually means the ability to be rational, the ability to be logical, the ability to evaluate an argument to see whether it's valid or not. Valable ou pas. And so, the importance of reason, of intelligence, of not only knowing our philosophy, but of knowing philosophy. The importance of seeing everyone equally. Is ISKCON, for example, a movement that emphasizes hierarchy the most or equality? If you go to a temple, if you meet a leader, is the strongest impression that we're all equal, we're all friends, or is the strongest impression hierarchy? If the strongest impression is hierarchy, then the body is being put above the soul. And so, anyway, we just need to get this thing straight. And finally, last thing, there's a desperate need for a transcendental French Hare Krishna movement. There's really a need for that. Following all the basic principles, same philosophy, everything, but there's a need for a French Hare Krishna movement. You will never, ever, ever culturally colonize this country. So don't even think about it. Rather, let's present a spiritual science to the French people. Anyway, thank you very much for allowing me to harass you in this way. Any questions on these points? Donations are acceptable at any time. I mean, you can just interrupt me at any time if you want to bring a very large donation. Just kidding. Sit and blog. Yes.
Regarding the idea of spiritual scientists, one may say that when you look at your scriptures, namely your Bhagavad Purana, your Srimad Bhagavatam, and so on, there's all sorts of information that one may claim to be not scientific at all, in terms of cosmology, in terms of time, and so on and so on. So on the one side, you're claiming for a spiritual science. What do you mean as a spiritual science? What are we presenting to the French people?
Okay. Good point. Almost. That's like a very common thing. first of all, tragically, people who get PhDs in science almost never take philosophy courses, and they never take epistemology courses where you actually learn the philosophy of knowledge. So take empirical science, okay? Let's take empirical science to begin with. There are a few things you should know about empirical science. One is its existential limitation, and the second is its, you could say, it's epistemological. Well, here are the limitations of empirical science. Now, when you're trying to scientifically investigate something, you have to design an experiment, because the essence of the empirical method is the controlled experiment. Now, there are two problems here. The first problem is, obviously, that if you are conducting controlled experiments, which is the essence of empirical science, you can only study things you can control. That's all you can study. It's like, for example, if you take a light meter. You understand what in French, what would that be? A light meter? Measures light. And you think this is the only valid scientific instrument. You go out into the world, you come back and say there is nothing out there but light. Or if you take a thermometer and you come back and say there's nothing out there but temperature. Or, in other words, you design an experiment, and the way you design the experiment determines what you can detect. And so, in a controlled experiment, a priori, you can only detect things that you can control. So to say that there is nothing in the universe that we cannot control in principle is as stupid as saying that I went out with a thermometer and there's nothing but temperature. If something is beyond your control, by definition, you could not detect it in a controlled experiment. So therefore, the essence of the empirical method makes it logically impossible to scientifically study things greater than scientists. Now, when I say logically impossible, that's a technical philosophical term. For example, let's say I come here and I tell you, please believe me, there are 12 unicorns in France. I saw them.
I believe you.
Yes. Did you see that? Here's a real disciple. So the point is, I mean, it's logically possible to send out, let's say, millions of people in France, so that simultaneously, every square meter of France is being simultaneously observed by someone with, normal visual abilities. And therefore, you could say that there actually are no unicorns in France. You could actually prove that empirically by simultaneously observing every square meter of French territory. So that's empirically not the fact that there are 12 unicorns in France. But some things are not empirically not the case. They are logically impossible. And I'll give an example. In other words, they are a priori impossible. For example, let's say someone says, I was driving through France today and I saw a square circle. Now, if you know what the English word square means, and if you know what the word circle means, then you know that the two words together, square, circle, actually mean nothing. The total semantic content of square, circle is 0. It doesn't mean anything. So it's not like, is there a square circle in France or not? There is no such thing. It's logically impossible for a square circle to exist, simply by the meanings of words. So in the same way, you could say that it is logically impossible, not empirically impossible, but logically impossible to detect God with a controlled experiment that is completely under your power. Now, if God wants to appear, like Krishna can appear, he can appear as Lord Chaitanya, he can appear as Krishna, he can appear as a burning bush in the Old Testament. If God wants to appear, sure, he can come. But in a controlled experiment, the underlying idea is that if something is there, we can find it whether or not that thing wants to be found. In other words, the object that we're experimenting on has no power to prevent us from discovering it. For example, let's say there's a planet that has conditions favorable to life according to our present understanding, which is very small. So, for example, scientists look for a planet that seems to have water in some form, because they take water as most essential ingredient for life. Now, if there is actually a planet out there that has water, the planet itself, the physical planet, cannot decide to hide from the scientists. So the nature of the controlled experiment is that the scientist has the power to find something if it's really there, and if the scientist has the tools necessary. Now, obviously, if you want to find something more powerful than you, that becomes absurd. For example, the French government, if they really want to talk to you, they will talk to you. You know, if you are still in France and not hiding, 100 feet under the ground or something, they will find you and they will talk to you. Now, if you want to talk to, let's say, Bhakti Emmanuel, if you want to talk to Macron, then, he may talk to you and he probably won't. I mean, of course he'll talk to me because I'm a sannyasi. But if you want to talk to le président de la 5e République, probably not. Probably not. Very unlikely. Unless he's your cousin or something. So if someone's in a more powerful position, they control the contact. They control the contact. So God, when you're looking for something empirically, even if you don't know if it's there, you presume that if it exists, it would have these qualities, and therefore you design an experiment that would detect the qualities that you believe are found in that object. That's actually the way you design empirical experiments. So, if we're looking for God, and if we take God to be the normal philosophical idea of God, namely a God that's all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, all good, then how would you design a controlled experiment to find someone infinitely greater than you? It's like a square circle. It's a contradiction in words. It's logically impossible to impose a controlled experiment on someone that has control over you. It's logically impossible. And therefore, it's just really bad philosophy. It's like if someone's an atheist. Atheism is very bad philosophy. Not just because there's really a God, it's just bad philosophy. Agnosticism, is okay. Because if there's no God, atheism means you actually say there's no God. You don't say, I don't know. You say, there is no God. Now, if there's no God, no one knows everything. And if no one knows everything, no one knows if there's a God. So atheism is just bad philosophy. It's like a dog chasing his tail. So, but getting back to your point, let's talk about, for example, the Bhagavatam talking about the universe in a way which is very different than, let's say, a modern astronomy book. Sariputta, who passed away, my godbrother, who I'm sure was the most brilliant scientist that ever joined the Hare Krishna movement. But anyway, he gave a very interesting example. Let's say, for example, you have an address. Like you are going, what's a typical street name?
Boulevard Saint-Germain.
Saint-Germain seems to be everywhere in France. Anyway, so you say you're going to Boulevard Saint-Germain 5. Saint-Germain Boulevard 5. And it's a building. And you walk in and you're supposed to meet somebody or go to someone's office and you can't find the person, you can't find the office. What you don't realize is it's a 10-story building. And the person is on the 8th floor maybe. But all 10 stories are Boulevard Saint-Germain 5. All 10 stories have the same address. So in the same way, empirical science cannot say that we do not live in a multidimensional universe. If we live in a multidimensional universe, then, for example, scientists can go, astronauts can go to the moon, which apparently they did, but they may be in the, how do you say, the ground floor in French?
Rez-de-chaussée.
Huh?
Rez-de-chaussée.
Yeah, the ground floor. So So as far as saying we make statements that disagree with modern, first of all, modern science has always said that the reason that we are better than religion, they've always said this historically, the reason science is better than religion is because religion has a fixed idea. You can't challenge the Bible, Jesus said, or Krishna said. Whereas in science, we are always open to correct our ideas. We never think we have the final truth. So therefore, no scientist can say we have the final truth, because it's the essence of the scientific method that you never have the final truth. So in many ways, it's also, what's the word? It's like what I call epistemological imperialism. Let's say you're a scientist, you do empirical science. Personally, I always found it very boring. And I always avoided science classes in school because, anyway, I appreciate science, it's nice, especially when I have to go to the dentist. I really appreciate science. But you do empirical science, and so you're saying that everyone has to be approved by your method. That's imperialism. Imperialism means that everyone has to bow to my will. But that's just what you do. Other people get knowledge in other ways. And so how can you say that only your way is the real way? In fact, if scientists did take philosophy classes, which they almost never do, they would realize they're contradicting themselves. Because if you say, for example, that nothing can be accepted as proved unless it is empirically proved, the problem is that you cannot empirically prove that everything must be empirically proved. I don't want to get too technical here, but in terms of philosophical terminology, it's called circular reasoning. The basic structure of an argument, philosophical argument, like the most typical example is, all men are mortal. Women, I guess, are immortal. But anyway, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So the typical structure of a logical argument has always been a premise, another premise, or more, and then a conclusion. Circular reasoning means that you take your conclusion, the thing you're trying to prove, and you give it as evidence of itself. So the premise and conclusion are just going around and around. So for example, let's say someone says, like a scientist, sorry for all this technical philosophy, but I'll try to wrap this up, but this is one more little example. It was your fault, you fed me. Anyway, for example, how do you know there's really a world outside your mind? How do you know there's really a world outside your mind? What if what you believe, let's say you think right now you are in north of Dijon and you're in a room with some devotees, or let's say some people out there. What if, as Descartes is a French philosopher, right? Descartes, René Descartes. He said, what if there's an evil genius? What if there's some evil being with great power? And what if right now you're like a brain in a laboratory and being made to think that you are north of Dijon? Now, how do you prove that's not true? Or to give another example, common example, you go to sleep and you dream. Tu rêves. So you go to sleep, you dream, you wake up. Now when you wake up, you decide in a second that the world you are seeing awake is more real than the world of your dream. Now how can you prove that? And why do you decide that? What if you woke up and decided, actually my dream was more real? Why do you decide that you are now seeing a world that is more real than the world in your dream? Because while you were dreaming, pendant le rêve, while you were dreaming, you thought it was completely real. You had no doubt about it. But when you wake up, you decide it's less real. Now, if I chant Hare Krishna and I experience a higher reality, Isn't that exactly what people do when they wake up from dreams? No scientist can prove that the dream world is less real than the world you're awake in. No scientist can prove that he or she is not just a brain in a bottle in some laboratory.
My
Yes.
question is,
Yeah, please.
I understand your point that we need someone who has already experienced the connection with God to learn about God. Do we really need all those satellite informations about the planets, about everything which is explained in the Bhagavatam to really experience God?
No, of course not.
Okay, so that just makes it simple, you know?
Yeah, of course.
Because there's specialists for many things.
Yes. I think the Bhagavatam is just sort of giving something for everyone. And so, like take for the 5th canto. I mean, even Prabhupada once said to me, see if you can figure it out. Prabhupada even said that he was just giving the basic translation, and then he asked his disciples, see if you can figure it out. But actually, Sariputta did figure it out. If you look at the 5th canto with the concentric circles, the islands and seas and everything, which is like, oh my God. It's like, we're the great sages on LSD or what. So, but actually, if you look at that, it turns out that the descriptions are a very precise description of our solar system. And actually, as Sariputta showed, it's a symbolic description. Not only that, but the descriptions of the planetary orbits, those circles, planetary orbits, are more accurate than anything that was known in Europe at the time. And so, I mean, there is symbolic language in the Bhagavatam. There is literal language. There's all kinds of things. There's hyperbole. There are many things in it. But I have to admit that I don't spend a lot of time reading those descriptions. I've read it before, but it's just not something that I'm interested in other things. So, yes.
And I wanted to ask you another question. When you met Prabhupada and he gave you this instruction, and you just knew he was a pure devotee, and you just... What happened? Did you see light? Or
I started hearing Beach Boys songs in Sanskrit. No, just kidding. I grew up in Southern California, so, wish they all could be California gurus. Anyway, when I think I would have to use the analogy like waking up from a dream. In other words, just to try to give some language to it. When I experienced Prabhupada, when I experienced Krishna, when I experienced myself, it was an awareness which was bigger, better, brighter, more coherent, just by every possible criteria that we would use to say this awareness is more real than that awareness. By every possible criteria, it was more real. And so therefore, it would have been irrational of me. Just like I can say the words in English or in French, you can say the words, what if my dream is more real than my waking consciousness? You can say those words, but in reality, everyone agrees that when they wake up, it's maybe not as happy, but more real in some way. And so it seems to be the case. It seems to be the case, or I would say it definitely is the case, that we are made in such a way, the nature of our consciousness is such that we actually have the power to perceive reality. And that's what Kant was saying and other philosophers, that it must be the case that the soul has the power to perceive, not only perceive reality, but to perceive different levels of reality. You see that yourself. For example, now, after living for, so many years, well, not so many compared to me, but more than more than 20 years ago. So now, after having lived, you know a lot more about yourself and about the world than you did before. And so, in other words, I'll kind of, to put this in very precise philosophical language. there's a epistemology. The Greek word episteme means knowledge. So epistemology is trying to logically figure out, how do you know? Under what conditions is it fair, is it reasonable for you to say that you know something? And under what conditions can someone say, that's just your opinion, you don't really know that. It's just your opinion. Plato talks a lot about this. So Aristotle actually was the father of modern logic. He made a very important point, and Lord Chaitanya made the same point, actually, which is interesting. Which doesn't necessarily mean that Lord Chaitanya studied Aristotle, but that it's, and this is the point they made, Lord Chaitanya and Aristotle and modern philosophy. And that is that whenever you say that something is true, you can say like, this is really me, or I really live in this house, or, the sky is really blue, or whatever. Whatever you say, someone can simply say, I don't believe it. The most stupid person in the world can say, I don't believe it. It doesn't take a lot of intelligence to say those words. So, but anything you say, they can say, I don't believe it. And then you have to prove it. And then you have to prove to give an example. I always give this simple example. Been giving it for too long. Don't think of a new one. But anyway, let's say you claim that water boils at, 100 degrees Celsius? Right?
Oh, 90.
Give me a number.
90.
I'm Fahrenheit. Give me a number in Celsius. What?
90.
Okay, 90 degrees Celsius. So, let's say that you claim that water boils at 90 degrees Celsius. And someone says, I don't believe it, prove it. So you put a pot on the stove, you put a thermometer in it, and you say, look, voila. 90 degrees Celsius, the water boils. Someone says, I don't believe that's pure water. Or I don't believe that's pure mercury in the thermometer. So you have to prove it's pure water. So you bring in some chemicals that test the water. And then they said, well, I don't believe those are real water testing chemicals. So the point Aristotle was making, although he didn't have this ingenious example of boiling water on a stove. Poor Aristotle, didn't have this analogy. But anyway, so Aristotle's point was that no matter what you claim is true, someone could say, prove it. You bring a proof. They say, prove that. And you are pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. So Aristotle says, if that's the case, you can never prove anything. There can never be knowledge. And yet there must be knowledge. Because we know that we know things. So how do we avoid an infinite regress of proofs and establish what we know is the case, that we really know certain things? So Aristotle said, as Lord Chaitanya said, that the way you do this is you have to make a stand, you have to déclarer, that there are some facts in the world that are self-evident. Self-evident. Because if something proves itself, you don't have to go outside to prove it. And this is exactly the word that Lord Chaitanya said. Swata pramanya. Swa in Sanskrit is French son or sa. Italian sua. Swa, it's the same word. Portuguese sua, it's the same word. Swa, sua, son, sa, which means one's own. So swataha in Sanskrit means from itself. From itself. Swataha. Do you say per se? Oh no. In Italian you say per se.
Latin.
What?
Latin.
Yeah, per se, by itself. So per se in Sanskrit is swataha. And the swat and the se are related. But anyway, so, and pramanyam means it stands as evidence by itself, from itself, proves itself. The word for evidence, by the way, in Sanskrit, pramana, is from the Sanskrit root ma, or mana, which means to measure. And that's where you get, for example, a metric. Metric is just matra. So literally the measure of something, the proof of it. You measure it. And so if you say, for example, If we say to the scientist, you cannot do empirical science because you can't prove there's a real world out there. If the scientist says, no, there is a real world because look, here's my arm, you can feel it. But obviously, logically, that's really an arm only if there's a real world. So unless there's a real world out there, that's not a real arm. It could just be a hallucination. And therefore, you can't take the thing you're trying to prove and use it as evidence for itself. That's the circular reasoning. What the scientist has to say philosophically, and they don't say it because they never take philosophy classes, but what the scientist really would have to say is that it is self-evident that there's a real world. The world presents itself to us in such a way that it proves itself. And anyone that doesn't see that that's a real world out there is simply somehow cognitively defective or deficient. If you, like for example, let's say someone let's say someone is blind or someone can't hear. If you can't see or can't hear, there's a real world there, then you have a problem in your own power of consciousness. But to normal people, it's self-evident. Or for example, let's say that you say that it's wrong to kill innocent people. Like a moral claim. It is wrong, it is morally wrong to kill innocent people. Now, you have to also say philosophically without extenuating circumstances. For example, here's a typical example you get in a university philosophy class. Let's say you're standing on a bridge. You're standing on a bridge and a train is coming. And what you see is that up ahead, the train track, has collapsed, and if the train continues, the train is going to fall, and all the people on the train will be killed. So maybe, like you say, hundreds of people will be killed, many of them women and children. Now, you're standing on the bridge looking down on this, and it just so happens, c'est le cas, que standing next to you is a very large, very fat man who's kind of, doesn't really know what's going on. Now, if you push this very large, fat man down off the bridge onto the train track, he will stop the train because he's like, he's really big and fat, and the train will put on the brakes, and that's the only way you can stop the train. Now, if you push the man, he'll die. So you killed him. But you saved maybe hundreds of lives, including women and children, by killing someone. So the question is, what is your moral responsibility there? Now, that's an interesting question, but the reason I raised it is because when I say that it's wrong to kill innocent people, I added, and there are no other circumstances that could possibly justify it. In other words, by killing innocent people, you did no good in the world. Absolutely no good in the world. You just killed innocent people. So now the point here is to get to the thing of being self-evident. I mean, don't all of us accept it as a moral truth that it is morally wrong to kill innocent people when there's no other circumstances, like maybe you're saving 1 million people. There's just no other circumstance. You are simply killing innocent people. Now, how do you know that's wrong? Do you know it's wrong just because your parents told you it's wrong, or in school they told you, or because you just have some emotion associated with it? Because according to evolutionary theory, which actually leads to very demonic conclusions, Hitler, by the way, Hitler was a very big fan of Darwin for certain reasons. Because if evolutionary theory is true and there's no God, then when you see someone killing innocent people, the only reason you feel bad, it's not really bad because values are metaphysical. You can't hold up a value like a red value, a blue value, a black value. Values are metaphysical. They're beyond the physical. So if there's only a physical world, there are no real values. That means justice is an illusion. Mercy is an illusion. Protecting innocent people is an illusion. And in fact, blind evolution programmed you. You are neurologically programmed to feel bad when you see, for example, innocent people being killed, because gene pools, gene collections where people somehow by blind evolution somehow had some negative emotional response to massacres or cruelty. Somehow those gene communities survive better because they were less inclined to slaughter each other. And therefore, nothing is wrong. Nothing is morally wrong. If you go into a school and murder, 1,000 children, that's not wrong. Because wrong is a value. Values are not empirical. They're metaphysical. Greek meta, beyond. There's no such empirical thing as a value. There's no empirical science cannot prove that there's any such thing as right or wrong, good or bad. It doesn't exist. And therefore, and here's the point here's the real point. Practically every sane human being lives in a bi-dimensional universe. A bi-dimensional universe. Because almost every human being believes that some things are really wrong. Some things are really wrong and some things are really right. If it's true that we're not just neurologically programmed, but some things are really right and wrong, what it means is there are non-physical, metaphysical entities that actually exist. And that means we live in a bi-dimensional universe, namely one that has a physical dimension and a metaphysical dimension. So if you don't accept that, if you think the world is entirely empirical, then you have to accept, you must logically accept, unless you just want to be a stupid hypocrite, you must logically accept that it is not really wrong to commit genocide. It's not wrong to rape, to murder, to kill children. Nothing is wrong. We just imagine it's wrong because we are neurologically programmed to imagine, but since there's nothing really exists except empirical things, and values, moral judgments are not empirical, nothing is wrong. So you see that if you take empiricism as the final supreme truth, basically it leads you to a world of monsters. It leads you to a monstrous, evil world. Whereas when you accept the soul in God, it leads you to goodness, it leads you to mercy, it leads you to awareness, to knowledge. Almost all scientists, hypocritically, even let's say almost all agnostic or atheistic scientists, hypocritically think that some things are really right and wrong. If someone may be, some big atheistic scientist, but if someone comes and rapes his wife or kills his child, he absolutely thinks that was evil, that was wrong. They don't know philosophy. They're just they're not very bright. I mean, they're good at science, but they're not very bright at other things. So, because there really is right and wrong, as all people believe, as a self-evident fact, again, an empirical scientist has to accept as a self-evident fact, can't prove it, that there's a real world out there. So when we accept as a self-evident fact that Krishna is God, or that some things are really right and wrong, we are actually doing the same thing they're doing. Philosophically, structurally, logically, there's no difference. And so when they say that science is rational and religion is just faith, they're just being stupid. So that's, anyway, philosophy. Yes, Gorangi.
So we accuse the spiritualists of blind faith,
What?
A lot of time we are accused.
Really? Holy cow.
Blind followers, blind faith.
Well, I think there actually are some, but not us.
So because sometimes you talk about blind doubt.
But what does it mean? What does it mean to have blind faith? For example, why does a scientist believe that there's a real world out there? But he can't prove it. So at what point does faith become blind? If you have a Krishna conscious experience, and you actually experience a higher reality, then how is your faith blind? So it's just throwing out words without really having any idea what the words mean. It's just like intimidation, it's like bullying. You know, these people are like bullies. They just like, and my faith isn't blind. I would say that person's faith that Krishna is not God is blind faith. Because that person has no knowledge of Krishna, has never attempted to get knowledge of Krishna, is unqualified to know Krishna. So the person that says that Krishna is not God, that technically is blind faith. Whereas if you have powerful Krishna conscious experiences, then your faith is not at all blind. It's actually rational faith, and it may be more than faith. It may be knowledge.
I like the point you made, blind doubt. You know,
Yeah, I'll make that
a
point.
lot.
We have a very common thing. They say in French, foi aveugle. That you have that expression?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so epistemologically speaking, if you doubt something that's true or believe something that's not true, it's the same. For example, let's say you doubt that 2 and 2 is 4. Or you doubt that Dijon is in France. You think Dijon is in Switzerland. And someone tells you, no, really, Dijon is in France. I don't believe it. So, if you doubt something that's not true, you are just as ignorant as if you believe something that is true. So why don't we have a common expression in French or English, blind doubt? If people are fair, why don't people say blind doubt? Why do they only say blind faith? Actually, Pascal, autre français, philosophe français, Pascal, Blaise Pascal, he actually came up with this very famous argument. It's called Pascal's wager. Pascal's
Paris.
Paris?
The Paris Pascal.
Paris de Pascal. Where he said there are 4 because he was also a mathematician. He was a really intelligent guy. So he said there are 4 logical possibilities. There's no God, and you believe there's no God. There is a God, and you believe there's no God. Wait. You don't believe in God, and there is a God. You don't believe in God, and there's no God. You believe in God, and there's no God. You believe in God, and there's no God. I mean, there's 4 possibilities. So he said, if there is no God, and you believe there is no God, there's no real benefit for you. First, because you'll never know if you were right. And second of all, there's just no obvious economic, psychological benefit in believing there's no God, even if it's a true belief, because you can never know it. And then he said, if you believe in God and there's no God, let's say you believe in God but there's no God, actually, according to modern science, you benefit. Because it turns out that people that really believe in God tend to recover more easily from medical problems. They tend to have better families. You know, not in every case, but there are actually certain benefits. Even if there's no God, if you really believe in God, there appear to be certain objective benefits. So if you believe in God and there is a God, you win everything. You know, you're the big winner. And if you don't believe in God and there is a God, you're the big loser. So he said, if you don't believe in God, either there's no benefit or it's a catastrophe if there really is a God. And if you believe in God and there's no God, you may actually still have a better life. And if there is a God, you win everything. So he said, it's in your rational interest to believe there's a God, or try to believe there's a God. That was Le Pari de Pascal. Pascal's wager, they call it in English. So anything else? I've been talking a long time. Maybe we'll stop here.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Merci à tous.
Merci.